forward a unanimous consent request to pass my bipartisan bill with our colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, entitled the Protect Reporters from Excessive State Suppression Act, also known as the PRESS Act. Before I make the unanimous consent request, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about why our colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, and I feel this legislation is so important. And I'll start with the basic proposition behind the legislation. If you don't have a free press, you don't have a democracy. My dad was a journalist. After fleeing the Nazis, he came to this country, taught himself English, worked in our army, developing propaganda that we dropped on the Nazis, and he believed deeply in individual freedom and press freedom, and would always tell me, Ron, they go hand in hand. If you want to see what happens when governments undermine and then eliminate the free press, look at Russia, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Iran. Information became a tool of power, abuse, and manipulation. That's what governments do when they want to keep freedom from breaking out in their countries. And so they abuse power rather than promote education, expression, and enlightenment among the countryside and the people. So let's be clear. The threat of government overreach interfering with the free press in the United States is not some distant, far-off, hypothetical idea. It happened very recently. The Trump administration spied on several journalists at outlets the disgraced ex-president personally disliked and attacked, grabbing phone and email records. The extent of this abuse of power has come out in shocking revelations over the last few years. And let me emphasize, the Trump administration was not the first to do this sort of thing. Both the Trump administration and the Obama administration went too far in prosecuting journalists just for doing their jobs. Now, members of the Senate talk pretty frequently about their interest in protecting journalism in America. My view is the Bipartisan Press Act is the best opportunity we have to make progress on that goal before the Congress ends, and we all hope that that is fairly shortly. The Press Act would protect the free flow of information by shielding journalists from being ordered by the courts to give up their sources. The bill includes key exceptions, such as when that information is necessary to prevent an act of terrorism against the United States or necessary to prevent the threat of imminent violence. Those exceptions were very important to Senator Lee and I. I see our colleague here from Arkansas. He and I serve on the Select Committee on Intelligence, so we know about the importance of protecting our country against terrorism. This legislation is very similar to legislation already on the books in several states, including my home state of Oregon and Senator Lee's home state of Utah. It's our view, though, that these protections should extend from sea to shining sea in our great country. Now, I'll close by saying this is a proposal that brings both sides together. The House passed the Press Act a few months ago unanimously, and I think our colleagues would agree that sometimes these days it seems you can't get every member of the House to even agree that there are 24 hours in a day and 7 days a week. Yet they passed our bill unanimously. This is a can't-miss opportunity to protect the free press in America. It's good for the free flow of information. It's good for holding government accountable. And it's good for the democratic ideals on which this country was founded. And I'll just close by way of saying that if you read the writings of the founding fathers, it was almost as if they thought a free press was as important, if not more so, than government. That's how strongly they felt. So let's pass the unanimous consent request when we make it. Let's send the Press Act to the President's desk today, and I will now ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4330. The Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
reserving the right to object, and I want to make a few brief remarks here about why I object to the passage of this bill, the so-called Press Act, which would open a floodgate of leaks damaging to law enforcement and our nation's security. The press, unfortunately, has a long and sordid history of publishing sensitive information from inside the government that damages our national security. During the Vietnam War, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers in an effort to demoralize the American people and turn them against the war effort. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the press routinely revealed details about America's efforts to hunt down terrorists, details that helped our enemies cover their tracks and evade justice. These leaks were reckless and harmful to our national security. Yet the Press Act would immunize journalists and leakers alike from scrutiny and consequences for their actions. This bill would prohibit the government from compelling any individual who calls himself a journalist from disclosing the source or substance of such damaging leaks. This effectively would grant journalists special legal privileges to disclose sensitive information that no other citizen enjoys. It would treat the press as a special caste of crusaders for truth who are somehow set apart from their fellow citizens. But that's not how the law historically has treated journalists. Our laws have always made clear that journalists can be held criminally liable for what they publish. In the Pentagon Papers case itself, a kind of holy grail for the liberal media, Justice White wrote, "The press is, quote, on full notice of the position of the United States and must face the consequences if they publish material damaging to our national security." So while prior restraints were ruled out, consequences for violating the laws of our country remain necessary. And they remain necessary today as well. Because moreover, if recent history has taught us anything, is that too many journalists these days are little more than left-wing activists who are, at best, ambivalent about America and who are cavalier about our security and about the truth. For instance, as the publisher of the New York Times, during the Pentagon's Papers case, Arthur Punch Sulzberger wrote, "I'm not sure what we offer the Vietnamese peasant or what their own leaders offer them is any better than what the communists offer." Think about that for a minute. The publisher of the New York Times, whose family still controls it today, couldn't see a difference between us, the United States, between Democratic presidents, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Ho Chi Minh, a murderous communist butcher. This is the kind of person we'd be giving special legal privileges to that no other citizen enjoys. Supporters of this bill insist that it's necessary to grant journalists this special kind of immunity in order to, quote, preserve the free flow of information to the public. But of course, there are many legal avenues that whistleblowers can use to air their concerns about potential government misconduct. In the executive branch, they can go to their agency's inspector general. They can also go through the Office of Special Counsel. And of course, they can go to the proper oversight committee here in Congress. Put differently, there's no shortage of legitimate and legal avenues for whistleblowers. to unveil potential government misconduct. But this bill would allow any disgruntled bureaucrat, totally unaccountable to democratic processes, to circumvent these legitimate channels and go straight to the press, relying on the highly questionable judgment and unaccountable judgment of these bureaucrats and reporters alone to determine whether America's most sensitive secrets should be revealed. And finally, quite aside from all these grave concerns, this bill hasn't been through the Senate's usual process for debating and refining legislation, and as I've explained, it shows. It hasn't been through regular order. There have been no hearings, no markups, or even a previous effort to pass the bill on the floor, to my knowledge. This bill needs to be thoroughly vetted before we take such a drastic step to ensure that we don't open a floodgate of damaging leaks to our national security. Therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from Oregon.
I think the fact there's been an objection here is very unfortunate. I'm just going to briefly, respond. Our colleague from Arkansas has talked about the exceptions that are made in this bipartisan bill. And I would only say that the exceptions to make sure we could protect our country, to deal with national security in this bill, were strong enough to get the support of 435 members of the House of Representatives. And I said, sometimes I look at the President of the Senate, he and I were in the other body. Sometimes you think you couldn't order a 7-Up over there. But the fact is, it got the support of every member of the House of Representatives, all 435, because they thought the exceptions made sense here. Second, my colleague from Arkansas said that this was somehow giving special status, special protection to the press in America. That's not accurate. This gives the press the kind of protection I believe the founding fathers would have supported, because I've read their writings and saw what they had to say about the press and have already noted it. And then our colleague seemed to make the case that this was somehow for liberal journalists, not for journalists who are moderate and conservative. This was for liberal journalists. The legislation extends to people in the press across the political spectrum. There are no special fast-track arrangements for people of one philosophy or another. And that was something that was especially important to me, Mr. President. I mentioned in my remarks my dad, who fled the Nazis, taught himself English, served in our army. And he worked particularly after his service writing historical nonfiction, wrote a very important book about the Bay of Pigs, where he highlighted what really happened. And what I enjoyed so much about my dad's book and what happened afterwards, the first person to call my dad, because he said, Peter, my dad was Peter Wyden, you're writing the truth about what happened, was the late Congressman Henry Hyde of Illinois, one of the most conservative members of the other body. And he and my dad struck up a fast friendship over the phone because they were interested in the facts. And that's what journalists do. They get the facts out. So I think it's unfortunate there's been an objection here. On all of these points, these issues were considered by the other body, and 435 members of the other body said, this is important for our country. This is important for getting the facts out to the American people. Unvarnished information, not information from the left, center, or right, unvarnished information. So I just want to close, Mr. President, by saying we're going to be back on this floor. We're going to push this again and again and again, because at a crucial time in America, where, and I mentioned, this has not been relegated to one administration or another. This has been happening too often. It happens in any kind of administration, any philosophy. It's time to end it. It's time to make sure that our free press is in a position to get the facts to the American people. We need this particular bipartisan effort of Senator Lee and I, and we will be back on this floor until we get it passed. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.